He sat alone in the empty room. The warm yellow light gently shone on a face marked by time. In his hand, he held an old photo, a blurry frame of a once happy family that used to be part of his life. He stared at it for a long time, his eyes revealing a deep contemplation. No tears fell, but the silence was heavier than any words. Maybe he wasn't afraid of love. Maybe what held him back all these years wasn't the lack of feelings, but a different fear, the fear of losing again, the fear that if he opened his heart, he would once again trade, once again lose, just like before. He once had everything: a home, a partner, children, calling his name every night. Then everything disappeared so quickly he couldn't even grasp what was happening. One afternoon, one conversation, one decision, and it was over. Since that moment, every time he thought about starting over, he felt his heart tighten, not because he didn't want to love, but because he couldn't believe that love wouldn't once again take away what he cherished most. There are thousands of men out there feeling the same way, especially when they've reached their 40s or 50s, the age people often think is strong enough to fear nothing. But in truth, that's when fear becomes the clearest. If you're watching this video and you feel that part of you has once avoided, once stayed silent, once turned down a chance just because of fear, then maybe you're not alone. Today's video doesn't try to make you do anything. It doesn't try to motivate or change you overnight. Instead, we'll go through the real things, from pain to fear, and then, maybe, to a new direction. Slowly, honestly, and for you, someone who has lost more than once in life. Before we talk about loving again, let's look directly at the root of that fear. Where does it come from? He once thought he was ready to start over, but just one unanswered message, one glance that made his heart sink, and he would step back again. Not because he didn't want to love, but because inside him was a crack that had never fully healed. A crack named fear of loss. That fear isn't uncommon, especially in those who have been through a lot. People call it fear of loss, the fear of losing, again the things once cherished. Along with it comes fear of intimacy, the fear of opening up, of letting someone see the most vulnerable parts inside. For many men, these two things are like invisible walls built between them and the world. The older they get, the thicker those walls become. After a divorce, after losing a loved one, or simply after years of living with the feeling of betrayal, a man can become very good at hiding his emotions. On the outside, he seems fine, still goes to work, still smiles and talks, but inside, he withdraws. A heart that once opened out of trust now closes out of defense. In the United States, according to statistics from the Pew Research Center, the divorce rate for second marriages is significantly higher than for first marriages. Among them, middle-aged men are the group most likely to face financial and psychological crises after divorce. They don't just lose a relationship, but often lose their home, assets, custody of their children, and sometimes even their image in society's eyes. Those accumulated losses make them cautious. They're wary of anything called starting over. John, 52, is a very real example. He used to be a stable businessman, owned a home, had a wife and children. His divorce came after nearly 20 years of marriage. He didn't just part ways with his partner, he split his assets, moved into a smaller apartment, and only saw his kids on weekends. From a confident and open person, John became quiet, often avoiding deep conversations. A friend once asked if he planned to love again. He just smiled gently and shook his head. "I'm not afraid to love, but I can't handle losing everything again." Many men like John choose to pack up their emotions, hiding them behind small talk, in their work, in solitary hobbies, because society often assumes that men must be strong, must be rational, must be steady in the face of pain. So they learn not to cry, not to talk much, and not to let anyone see what's really going on inside. But not speaking doesn't mean not feeling. The more those fears are held in, the more quietly they grow, making people lose the ability to truly connect with others. And when you can't connect with anyone, eventually you can't connect with yourself either. But that's only the beginning of the story. So what happens when this fear continues to control our lives? He had lived alone in a small apartment in the suburbs for over 10 years. The room wasn't filled with much, just an old armchair facing a television screen that stayed on without sound, and a wooden table by the window whose curtains were rarely drawn. Every morning, he made himself a cup of coffee, sat in silence, listening to the ticking clock, then left the house right on time. Evenings were just as quiet. No one waiting, no one asking, no one to share the day with. He once had a family, once had cozy evenings, once held his child to sleep, once sat in the kitchen with his wife, planning summer vacations. But since the breakup, he hadn't wanted to enter another relationship. Not because he didn't have the chance, but because every time he thought about starting over, his mind filled with negative assumptions. What if everything fell apart again? What if he lost everything again? What if it hurt more this time? For the past 10 years, he had turned down every dinner invitation, every conversation that might go beyond small talk. He kept himself safe by not letting anyone get close. But because of that, he had become more and more distant from the world around him. His health slowly declined, not from serious illness, but from lack of exercise, lack of spirit, lack of connection. Doctors advised him to work out, to join community activities. He nodded, but rarely went. The habit of being alone had become deeply ingrained in his rhythm of life, and the fear, though invisible, quietly controlled every decision. Even with his son, the child, who once begged him every night for a bedtime story, now only called on birthdays or Thanksgiving. That relationship had no conflict, but lacked warmth. No arguments, but no closeness either. Simply a distance formed by prolonged silence, and by no one daring to step across that wall first. When a man lets fear take control for too long, he's not just avoiding pain, he's also refusing the chances to live happily once again. Maybe no one hurts him again, but in return, there's no one left to hold hands with through winter. Maybe he no longer loses anything, but he also has nothing to look forward to when he wakes up in the morning. Fear of loss, if not recognized and addressed properly, it will gradually become a cage, and that cage is built not by anyone else, but by ourselves. But here's the good news: this fear is not a life sentence. We can recognize it and change it every morning. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusted his collar, smoothed his hair, then looked at himself but never truly saw what the person inside was feeling. Because for many years, he had learned to stay silent with his own emotions. Every time he felt angry, he held it in. Every time he felt sad, he told himself, "I'm fine." And every time he felt lonely, he buried himself in work, his phone screen, or a familiar television show just to keep his mind busy. But emotions don't disappear, they just hide, waiting for the right moment to come back even stronger. The first step to overcoming fear doesn't lie in trying to be stronger, but in daring to sit with oneself and name what one is feeling. Anger, hurt, shame, embarrassment, the feeling of being abandoned, all of those are real, and all deserve to be heard, and they don't make him weaker. On the contrary, by facing them, he is taking the first steps to regain control of his life. One simple but effective way to do this is writing. Each night before bed, he takes a few minutes to write down what made him uncomfortable that day. Not to complain, but to see clearly, because sometimes just seeing those words appear in front of him helps him understand himself a little more. And from understanding comes the beginning of healing. In addition, he can also try something he's always been hesitant about: talking to someone who listens, a therapist. Not for treatment, not for someone to tell him what to do, but to have a safe space where he doesn't have to act like he's okay, where he can say things he thought no one wanted to hear, and not be judged. That can sometimes bring more relief than any advice. And then, one day, he decided to join a support group for men who had gone through divorce. On the first day, he just sat and listened. His face was tense, his eyes guarded and defensive. But there, he saw other men just like him, same age, same struggles, who had also gone through heartbreak and silence for years. When one man in the group shared about his first night alone after his wife moved out, his voice choking, he looked down at his own hands, and for the first time in many years, he felt his heart move. He raised his hand and asked to speak. His voice was soft, slow, but real. I thought I was used to this, but actually, I've never dared to face it. Allowing himself to grieve didn't pull him back into the past. It simply helped him accept that what happened was real. And only when emotions are acknowledged can they stop quietly controlling him. Because no one can move forward with a suitcase full of unopened sorrow. And no one can love again without first forgiving themselves for the last heartbreak. Once fear is understood, the next step is to rebuild trust, both in oneself and in others. After months of sitting with his emotions, he began to think about opening his heart again, not because he was so lonely that he needed someone to fill the void, but because for the first time in a long while, he felt he could be truly honest with himself. But this time, he didn't rush. He didn't dive into love as if running away from loneliness, nor did he build romantic illusions to cover up the past. He learned to move slowly. The first thing he did was set clear boundaries for himself. He understood that a healthy relationship didn't require him to give up all of who he was. He had the right to keep his own space, the right to say no if he didn't feel ready, and most importantly, the right to choose what was good for him, not out of fear of losing. Not because of pressure to be with someone, but because he knew his true worth. He started to exercise more regularly, not just to improve his health, but to regain a sense of control over his body after a long time of neglect. He read books, learned a new skill, spent time on old hobbies like photography, hiking, or simply making a cup of coffee and sitting quietly watching the sunset. Each small action like that helped him feel like he was living, not just existing. The feeling of confidence slowly returned, but this time it came from within, not from needing to prove anything to anyone. When he started dating again, things weren't easy. Sometimes he didn't know how to start a conversation. Sometimes he hesitated to talk about the past. Sometimes he felt like he wasn't ready. But instead of hiding it, he chose to share honestly. He didn't tell everything to complain, but said enough for the other person to understand he had been hurt, and he was learning how to start again. He met her during a weekend conversation at a small coffee shop. She didn't ask too much. She didn't try to comfort him. She just listened and nodded when he stopped talking. There was something in her eyes that made him feel safe. Not because she was perfect, but because she wasn't in a hurry. Every time they met, he realized he didn't have to play the role of a tough man. He could talk about sleepless nights, about things that once made him feel like a failure. And the surprising thing was, he didn't feel weak for doing that. Many studies have shown that men who enter stable, long-term relationships not only have better mental health, but also live longer, get sick less, and are more satisfied with life. But not every relationship brings that. Only those built on honesty, respect, and emotional safety truly help people grow and heal. He didn't know where this would lead, but what he did know was that, for the first time in many years, he no longer felt afraid when thinking about loving someone. He also didn't expect everything to be perfect. What he hoped for was simply this: to have someone to walk with on the road ahead. Someone willing to listen and learn how to love again, slowly and sincerely. And when you're ready, you'll realize loving again isn't about risking everything, but about a new chance to live fully. No one can guarantee that if you love again, you won't get hurt. No one promises that the person you meet next won't leave, won't disappoint you, or will always do exactly what you hope for. But no one forbids you from choosing to live a life no longer ruled by fear. There are pains in the past that you can't erase, but that doesn't mean you have to live forever in their shadow. Fear only has power when you let it take control. But once you dare to face it, dare to name it, and dare to take one small step forward, you've already reclaimed part of your freedom. You don't need to do anything big right now. No need to plan far into the future. Maybe it's as simple as sending a message to an old friend you haven't spoken to in a while, or inviting your son out for dinner, for no reason other than wanting to reconnect, or on a weekend afternoon, choosing to sit down at your usual coffee shop and reopen an old dating app, not to find someone right away, but just to allow yourself to come closer to the possibility of having a companion again. John did just that. After a long journey through pain, through silence, through countless nights, wondering if he could ever love someone again, he sat alone in a softly lit room. Phone in hand, a woman's profile photo appeared. Nothing perfect. No flowery description, just a face that gave him a sense of calm. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then, gently, he tapped accept. In that moment, there was no loud music. No fireworks, just a small smile at the corner of his lips, but enough to know that he had started again. If you're watching this video and feel that a part of this story is yours, then remember, no one is forcing you to change right away, but you can begin in your own way. No one can live for you, and no one can love for you. The choice is still in your hands, as it has always been. If this video touched something inside you, leave a comment or share it with a friend you think might need to hear this too. And if you want to continue walking with me on the journey of exploring the emotions and inner world of the grown man, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for staying until the end. See you next time.